AI is going to change the way that we live, work, whatever. I think there's a lot of fear. And so without putting these guardrails and a mechanism in place, there's fear that it'll just start to run rampant and we won't have any mechanism to control it.
Hi, I'm Ben Carr, Chief Security and Trust Officer with Halcyon. I'm here with Jonathan Dambrot from Cranium. Talk to me about AI.
My point of view is I'm really optimistic. I think the investments are coming from above, and now the CISO community is really struggling, but also excited about the fact that now we have to think about how to really manage this.
Where do you think CISOs really need to focus when they think about security around AI?
I think from an adversarial perspective, it's the Wild West. They have access to all of these tools, and they're going to start using them to make it easier to do their jobs, make it cheaper, just like we are looking at the enterprise, but they don't have any compliance requirement.
So my takeaway here, if I'm reading one from you and you tell me if I'm wrong, is as a CISO, if you're not thinking about AI and a way to address it for your company, you better really start getting in front of that ball, because otherwise you're going to really have no way to get out of this hole. Hi, I'm Ben Carr, Chief Security and Trust Officer with Halcyon, and I'm here with Jonathan Dambrot from Cranium.
Yeah.
Jonathan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. Yeah, it's Blackhat 2024, having some interesting conversations, and really appreciate you sitting down and taking the time to chat. Talk to me about AI. Like you're in the midst of it, right? Cranium's focused on this space. Like a real thing, or are we overhyping like AI?
Yeah, this is definitely one of those situations where you ask, like it's the economist thing. Like you ask 6 economists, you get 7 answers. I think everyone has a different point of view on this. My point of view is, I'm really optimistic. I don't see a reduction in investment in AI. And I'll tell you where we see this from. Like almost every enterprise CEO is getting on their quarterly calls and they're saying AI is an absolute imperative. They're continuing to make investments, and those investments are now starting to go into production, right? So over the course of the last couple of years, 2-3 years ago, people weren't talking about this. It was a very small part of the discussion. Last year is really when it picked up. People thought about AI governance and started to build those teams. Like, what's my policy? How do I think about the frameworks? What do I do? This year, it feels very much around now. I have to think about this tactically. I have to put things in place. I now need to own this and understand it. And it's become a really significant priority for them. And that's what we're feeling. I think we're seeing that directly. And I think the investments are coming from above. And now the CISO community is really struggling, but also excited about the fact that now we have to think about how to really manage this.
Yeah. So when I was thinking through like your response there, and I thought, man, there's like 18 different like paths we could go on conversation, right? And so one of the things I think about with AI, and when I hear the conversations happening, we're using kind of the broader term of AI, and a lot of times what we actually mean is LLMs, right? Or very specific like verticalized areas of AI, not AI as the overarching thing that AI could be. So how do you see that? Like, are we misusing the terms? Are we not talking specifically enough? Are like when the CEO comes to the rest of the E staff and the CISO and says, "Hey, we got to get on this AI bandwagon and do some AI stuff," and then like you see it's really just an LLM initiative, like, or is it misplaced? Like, how do you justify that?
Yeah, I definitely see it in a couple of different ways. So historically, I would agree with you, right? Machine learning is getting confounded with this concept of Gen AI.
Yeah.
But now I think we're seeing AI just cover it all. Okay. If you've got ML ops and you're building your own machine models, or you're using open source models, or you're using foundational models, I think we're now looking at that. That's kind of a catch-all. I think AI is just the terminology that people have just accepted is now all of it. I do think that there are definitely different types of enterprise customers, and it's really industry driven. So for instance, like financial services, life sciences, some of these industries that are really have adopted machine learning and AI over a long period of time, I would say, they are a combination, like continuing to invest in their own models, continuing to use open source, and also now a lot of RAG architectures to support very large LLM infrastructures, multiple data sets across their business. In some cases, we're seeing hundreds. Like we have a customer who's trying to push 600 or 700 use cases through the architectures to go into production. So those become real. I think other industries are really just consumers. And in that consumer use case, it is definitely more LLM driven. So I would say legal is one of those, right?
Sure.
Where that industry is really not going to develop their own AI systems. They're not developing models, but they're users of services, SaaS services that are taking contracts, reading them, providing context, and pushing that back to attorneys as an example. I think that industry will have to worry about different things. They're going to have to worry about how those LLMs get put into a construct, how that data gets used. It's just it's a slightly different view of how to think about AI. So I don't know, we're seeing quite a bit of difference based on size, industry, and if you're a builder or consumer.
So where do you think CISOs really need to focus when they think about security around AI? I break it down into kind of three phases. I'm interested to see if you agree. So there's the, hey, I've got to use AI to help me in that security context to provide better security to the organization. I've got to protect the models, right, that we're using within AI. And then the third thing is the adversary, right? How is the adversary going to use AI and compromise and make my job harder as a CISO? So are those the three? Is there a fourth? Is there something else that I'm missing? Or
I think you've captured that perfectly. I do think the regulatory piece starts to come into this picture quite a bit now as well. So how do I think about the regulatory architectures? EU AI Act has now hit. Mm-hmm. People are really concerned about that. And even the definition of AI is different in Europe potentially than it is in some of the, presidential EO or other EOs that have been written here in the States. So, those are some things that I think are impacting, but I think you've hit that right on. And when we think about also, adversarial use of AI, I think we're at the very beginning, right? I think it's still too easy for these adversaries to use non-machine learning, use cases, but you're starting to see proliferation.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of really response to that, right? I've seen people talking about the other side of the coin, but I haven't really, people generally will have the conversation, but it just gets left, and there hasn't really been a lot of thought, I think, put into that. So are you seeing the same thing, that it's really early days in that?
I think so. I'm not necessarily the right person to ask about some of those things. We're really focused on how does AI come into an enterprise? How does it get built? How do we think about the models, the data, the toolkits, how we support use cases for an enterprise? I think from an adversarial perspective, though, it's the Wild West. Just, I think they have access to all of these tools, and they're going to start using them to make it easier to do their jobs, make it cheaper, just like we are looking at the enterprise, but they don't have any compliance requirement.
Yeah, well, I think we've seen some of it, like the early phases of it, voice fakes, right? Yeah. Visual fakes, right? Like we've seen that happening. So I think, it's going to get worse. So, on the parts that you do think about, right, with what Cranium's doing and securing the environment, how should a CISO approach it, right? Because we come from this security background. We don't have a lot of background. Like, companies have talked about AI, but it hasn't been as prevalent as it is now. Yeah. And when we're now trying to think about how to defend our organization and the models that people are building like really, really quickly, how does a CISO get his hands around that?
Yeah, and I think that's the really important part is there's been a pace to AI that has gone unabated, and the organizations that we work with, it's just been go, go, go. How do we just allow our yellow or build teams to go fast? I think enterprises are trying to take a step and try to understand where AI is in their organization, how to define it, what does it mean, how do we put a policy around it, and then how do we form an AI governance community? That AI governance community, I'm probably seeing about 50% of the time is run by the CISO. Mm-hmm. The rest of the time it's, head of AI, legal, risk, other stakeholders. And so this becomes, and in any case, CISO is always involved. So there's a huge opportunity for the CISO to drive leadership. But the security organization has not historically been the place where you put your data scientist. Yeah. So trying to have a conversation, especially as you're building a threat model with people who have historically not necessarily used data science in those means, in those aspects, has now proven difficult to get up to speed. So you're starting to see directors of AI security put in place, people who are now responsible, bringing more data science talent into the security realm, which I think is important. And I think you'll see more and more of it.
Are you seeing the talent there, or are you seeing that that's an area where we're going to find just kind of this talent vacuum where we don't have people to fill?
No, I think we've had a talent vacuum. I think now people are trying to put others in those spots. And I think those are positions that are hard, right? So now you need cybersecurity talent, you need specialized AI talent. It's why this conversation around AI red teaming has become very difficult, because the type of individual who's responsible for that task has to have deep background of both. And there's fewer.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Like when you think about security, like we deal with really large data sets. We deal with really complex questions around data and how to best protect the environment. I've seen some larger organizations where they made the investment and brought in kind of data scientists and people from math and statistical backgrounds that actually you wouldn't think about as typical cyber. But yeah, I've seen most companies have not made that investment on the cyber side today.
Yeah. And for Cranium, the way we're trying to position is really thinking about ourselves as an AI company first. So we have an incredible AI microservices team that focuses on building kind of our own RAG architectures and building models into those as well. And then AI security, where, our AI security team helped write MITRE Atlas, like a lot of the pieces that came together helped drive some of the research at MITRE, helped do some of the original AI red teaming in these spaces. So bringing those together becomes really interesting. And I think most people are now just trying to add AI to what they're doing. I think for us, we want to be AI centered and then bring those security use cases.
Makes a lot of sense. So one of the things we talked about a little bit before we went on air was we talked about regulation, right? And it's been interesting from Halcyon, from the ransomware side of it. There's this question of where do we draw the line? Where do we call things terrorism? Where do we get involved? How do we change the discussion about it? And I think that same thing's happening on the AI front, right? With regard to legislation, and is it going to be helpful to increase legislation? We talked about the threat actors not actually having to follow regulation, right? And then jurisdictionally, if you don't even think about threat actors, just jurisdictionally, nation to nation, if one nation decides not to take on regulation or not to impose the right set of controls around AI, it can operate in a vacuum without any impact from those states that are imposing regulation.
Well, right. And does it give a natural advantage or disadvantage? So this has become really an interesting set of circumstances we find ourselves in. I think we're going to look back 10 to 15 years. So if you think about the countries that have really focused on this, I think the EU generally has taken the lead in being able to drive the EU AI Act. Now, there are some complaints about how that's been done, but I think overall, bringing the stakeholders together, understanding how to help define this, and making it a living document, I think is probably the right way to go. The problem is it's having somewhat of a chilling effect on AI companies coming into Europe. You're seeing some of that play out. The US has done what it has done historically, which is not necessarily build federal laws, but there's a presidential executive order. There's some other mechanisms coming out of CISA and obviously NIST AI Risk Manager Framework. And then the individual states have put mandates and executive orders for the governors in certain states to help support it. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Will it be very similar to GDPR, how that kind of came down, right? Yeah. But then you see countries like India. And India purposely said, we're going to hold a little bit here. We're not necessarily going to regulate AI the same way. And so then the question becomes, does that become a place where AI organizations go because there is not as much regulation? I think, my personal point, my perspective is we need a certain level of legislation here just simply because, AI is going to change the way that we live, work, whatever. And I think there's a lot of fear. And so without putting these guardrails and a mechanism in place, there's fear that it'll just start to run rampant and we won't have any mechanism to control it. However, adversaries don't care. So now the cost of AI, as you've seen, has come down. Well, you could argue, but the tool access has come down. The things that we can do today over the last 2 years have just...
Yeah, the democratization of AI is here, right? It's accessible. Yeah.
And so without regulation and with these adversaries having access, I think we're going to see more and more problems where, exponential technologies building off of each other. And if we don't have that right defenses, or if we're regulated against using certain types of AI, I think it'll put somewhat of a disadvantage. Gotcha.
So again, the corollary to the ransomware side, if we have these independent nations making their own independent regulations and rules, it leads to hodgepodge, right? It leads to a disparity in the playing field, right? Do you think we'll get to, or do you advocate for getting to kind of a consortium, an international response that's kind of one set to kind of overarching, you're always going to have lower governance at a lower level, but this overarching responsibility and adherence to a set of rules around AI? I mean, in the cyber world, it's just really hard to contain on a national border, right?
Like a Geneva Convention.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
It's been discussed. I think there's been some efforts to bring people together to try to put a more multinational consortium together. I think the challenge right now is that if we think about it as an arms race, if we think about how imperative AI and competitive AI is to these countries, it's very difficult to be the first one to say, okay, I'm willing to accept.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? It's that first.
Well, it goes
I'm
back.
Going to do this.
We referenced in one of the other podcasts we were doing earlier today. The dinner we were both at last night, right? And looking at the motivations of that state, like you have to put yourself in their shoes and not look at it at the motivations you have, but what are the motivations the other party has.
Right.
And I think that disparity will be really hard to get some type of governance over that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of countries want to win this AI race. And I don't think it is. I think we're going to see this, innovation continue indefinitely. I think AI, we're at the very beginning of some of these use cases. We haven't touched AGI, obviously, but we're obviously on that path to drive it. And the US has been investing more than anyone else in the world by a factor here, like 3 to 4x of what any of the closest competitors, or maybe it's even higher than that. So I think we would probably have I'm not sure the US would actually participate. So it's a weird dynamic, and I don't expect it to happen.
Yeah. So my takeaway here, if I'm reading one from you, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is as a CISO, if you're not thinking about AI and a way to address it for your company, you better really start getting in front of that ball, because otherwise you're going to really have no way to get out of this hole.
Well, if we think of every enterprise today as a technology business, and we think about the fact that every technology business is now going to embed AI in some form, whether that's machine learning, open source, or foundational model and LLMs, we better quickly get on this bandwagon and understand it at a minimum. But I think even more than that is really figure out, how do we harness it? How do we control the things that we need to understand better? How do we put the people on our teams that really understand it? And how do we put frameworks and tools in place that enable us to do that at scale? Because you can't use some of the things that you can't use some of the technologies as well as some of the things that we've done in the past. Those like manual mechanisms don't work.
It just won't work.
They don't work. Yeah.
Jonathan, thank you very much. I appreciate you sitting down and spending some time with us. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me.